Welcome to Random Flyer, the podcast that brings you the true stories of New Zealand's airline pioneers. Today, we're looking at the Douglas DC-3 Dakota fleet of the New Zealand National Airways Corporation, where they came from and where they went. The Douglas DC-3 story starts with the RNZAF Air Transport Services and their fleet of Lend-Lease Douglas C-47 Dakotas. The RNZAF supported their World War II efforts in the South Pacific by the development of a transport organisation allowing supplies, reinforcements and personnel to be rotated on an 8-week basis. The fleet were number 49 by the end of the war, made up of 13 of the original C-47A and 36 of the C-47B, fitted with Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin-wasp 2-stage turbo-supercharged engines. Orders were placed with the United States in November 1942 for C-47 Dakotas and Lockheed C-60A Lodestar aircraft to be placed with number 41 Squadron RNZAF, being established in July 1943. By August 1944, there were 20 Dakotas and 9 Lodestars on strength. December 1944, the fleet was then augmented with 4 short Sunderland Mark III flying boats. The Dakotas were ferried direct from the USA by RNZAF personnel. 41 Squadron's role include ferrying personnel, ground staff, mail, urgent freight and aviation ferry flights delivering new aircraft between New Zealand and forward bases in the Pacific. Number 41 Squadron flew regular scheduled services between New Zealand and Guadalcanal, touching intermediate RNZAF bases. The C-47s linked up peripheral Pacific Islands and advanced airfields via island hops to support troops and supplies. They were seen at Norfolk, Admiralty Islands, Cook Islands, Guadalcanal, Tonga, Vanuatu, and flew supply missions to the J-Force. As the war wound down, RNZAF Dakotas and other transports repatriated troops and staff from Pacific bases back to New Zealand. The peak of repatriation by air was reached in November 1945 when an average of 450 personnel were being evacuated by air weekly. The first and only casualty involving a loss of life in the RNZAF transport service occurred that month when a C-47 flight to New Zealand crashed with the loss of 21 lives. Internally, by mid-1945, daily services were being provided by C-47 between Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch and Auckland, New Plymouth, Wellington. The purpose of these flights was to transfer personnel between demobilisation centres and out to their hometowns. As demobilisation wound down, these scheduled services were then open to the public and fare-paying passenger traffic increased dramatically until, by December 1946, 90% of passengers carried by the Defence Force air transport system were civilians. Meanwhile, the debate over the nationalisation of air services had been mounting and culminated with the New Zealand National Airways Act 1945, passed in December that year. The Act established the state-owned enterprise New Zealand National Airways Corporation. The RNZAF booking offices within New Zealand were then taken over by the New Zealand National Airways Corporation in 1947. By March 1948, it was reported that there are 12 DC-3s flying for NAC, 11 passenger planes and 1 Freightliner. They were all B models and had been produced at the Douglas Aircraft Factory in Oklahoma and were Block 5 through Block 35 machines. Most of the A model airplanes were sold to Airwork New Zealand Limited, broken down for parts and never entered service. Many of the C-47s were flown to Australia for passenger conversion. Most of those planes went to the Melbourne workshops of the Australian National Airways Corporation, but some went to other smaller facilities. This work involved removing military fittings including cargo hooks, tie-down points and gun mounts, replacement of electrical looms and hydraulic lines, and removal of the military cargo floors, which were replaced with passenger-type floors fitted with seat rails. The walls and ceiling were properly lined with insulation, soundproofing and lighting, and seats were installed for between 21 and 28 passengers, using fabric upholstery and fittings patterned on contemporary Australian National Airways DC-3s. Emergency exits were modified or relocated to comply with passenger aviation regulations. Work was also done on the flight deck with new radios and navigation gear and a new modern trim fitted. The engines were zero-timed or replaced with overhauled units, and the propellers were recertified or replaced with Hamilton standard hydromatic controllable pitch propellers. The exterior was stripped and resprayed with the NAC livery, which was a silver fuselage, red cheat line, and black lettering. All of these planes have been brought on charge to the RNZAF between February and August 1945, so they were all about 2 years old at the time they were converted. The first, ZK-APA, was converted and entered service in March 1947, and the work ran through to October 1947, with the final plane, ZK-APK, being delivered. That first batch of 12 or so Dakotas from 1947 was really the backbone of early post-war New Zealand civil aviation. They were the founding fleet that made the new government airline possible when it launched on 1st of April 1947. 3 of those planes, ZK-AOJ, ZK-APA and ZK-AOZ, eventually went to Polynesian Airlines. They were the only ones of the batch that went through the Skyliner conversion in 1964. AOJ then went to Laos, where it was crashed in 1971. AOZ was ridden off in Darwin in the 1974 cyclone there, having been taken by an Indonesian operator, and APA crashed in Apia in 1970. AOI, APK and APB went to Airland or James Aviation for work as top-dressing planes. AOI ended up with Southern Super Air and crashed in the South Island in 1973. APK became the Mangaweka Skyliner, but is now for sale as a restoration project, and APB went to Airland, then Field Air, before being broken up, with the nose section going to the Sports and Vintage Aviation Society in Manawatu in the 1980s, but was subsequently sold to a private owner for use in their garden. AOE and AQT crashed while in service. Freighter AOE crashed into hills in the Marlborough Sounds on 9 August 1948, killing both of the crew, while AQT crashed on approach to Paraparaumu on 22nd of May 1954, killing 3 of the 28 on board. AOH went to McRobertson Miller Airlines in Australia before going to Indonesian operators, where it remains derelict. AQP was returned to the RNZAF to work as a parachute jump ship before being sent to the Comoros Republic, and was last seen in Kansas in the year 2000. AQS was sold to Far East Transport Service of Taiwan. 1948 and 1949 saw the delivery of 2 more machines following conversion at Palmerston North. ZK-AQU returned to the RNZAF for parachuting and was then sold in the Comoros Republic and last seen in South Africa in 2002. The DC-3 Dakota fleet for the New Zealand National Airways Corporation was augmented in dribs and drabs during the first half of the 1950s, and most of this 1950s batch was refurbished and updated to Skyliner standard during 1963 and 1964. Skyliner was NAC's in-house conversion program to give passengers a more airliner feeling. The larger turboprop Viscounts and Friendships had commenced service, and the interiors of the DC-3s were now 20 years old. The most obvious change was the larger windows. Fabric ceiling and side panels were replaced with lightweight plastic laminates. Insulation and soundproofing was improved. The seats were improved with thicker foam and were given headrests. Seating layout was revised to provide more room. Heating and ventilation was also enhanced, and on the flight deck, new navigation systems were introduced. The first 5 to 10 years for this fleet was spent flying most of NAC's network, except for some smaller cities whose airfields were inadequate for service. Of the 13 planes that came online during the 1950s, 5 left NAC and went to top-dressing companies. ZK-AYA went to James Aviation. ZK-BBJ went to Field Air in the 1970s, then Alpine Helicopters, Speedlake Freight, and was last seen in Kenya. AZL was taken by James Aviation and is currently on display at the Clydesdale Museum in Hamilton. Freighter AOW went to Airland for top dressing in 1963, then Field Air, and its nose section is preserved at the Wanaka Transport Museum. ZK-AWP finished with NAC in the early 1970s and was converted by them to a top dresser. It then flew for various operators until being restored by Air Chatham's to fly their North Island scheduled runs. It was sold to an owner in Darwin in early 2025. Another 3 of the planes went to Laos. AYL went there in 1968, then to a vocational school in America, where its status is currently unknown. AYK also went to Laos in 1968, but was written off in 1970. AZN went to Laos in 1970, but was written off in a storm there in 1976. 2 more of this batch were returned to the RNZAF. ZK-AQW went in 1961 for a final flyby celebration before going to the Comoros Republic, then Kansas, and was last seen in South Africa. ZK-AZM was returned in 1966 as a parachute jump ship. ZK-AZM was also returned in 1966 as a parachute jump ship before being withdrawn in 1977, also went to the Comoros Republic, and also went to South Africa. ZK-AYZ crashed into the Kaimai Range on 29 March 1963, killing 23 passengers and 2 crew. ZK-BEU went to the Mount Cook Line in 1970, but was broken up in Wanaka following the filming of the 1980 movie Race for Yankee Zephyr. For about 20 years, those planes formed the spine of NAC's operation. They operated the Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, Dunedin, Invercargill trunk service, offering 3 or more flights per day by 1950. However, by the end of the 1950s, the Vickers Viscount had arrived and was replacing the DC-3 Dakota on the main trunk lines between Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, Dunedin and Invercargill, relegating the DC-3s to regional spokes, Napier, New Plymouth, Westport, Hokitika, Timaru. However, even on those routes, the DC-3 was on thin ice. The Fokker F-27 Friendship had also started arriving in 1961 with staggered deliveries through the 60s and 70s. The last NAC Douglas DC-3 service touched down in Timaru on the evening of Thursday, 19 December 1974, where it turned around and flew off into history.